Say what you will about mainstream religions and their beliefs, and I could say a lot. I don't believe that such groups are purposefully put together in order to satisfy the carnal desires and greed of a few people, nor do I believe that their very existence is a plague that should be wiped out. I know not everyone is going to agree with me about this, and that's fine. There's plenty of bad things to say about mainstream religious groups, and I'm personally not a big supporter of organized religions. But I am a big supporter of free will and the freedom to believe whatever you want when it comes to our ultimate existence, where we come from, and where we'll end up. I think anyone can see that mainstream religious groups over the centuries have not been only destructive, and have not only been about hurting people or unduly influencing their lives for the worse. When it comes to destructive cults, that's another matter. In our desire to defend religious freedoms, we should not confuse these two different kinds of groups. There are clear indications and characteristics of destructive cults, as I've covered at length in other videos on this channel. I am not of the belief that destructive cults are simply smaller or newer versions of mainstream religions. They are their own kind of group, and many exist without religious ideas of any kind. Unfortunately, academics like Flynn do not make such distinctions, and that is how they end up defending the indefensible. In reading his work, Flynn was obviously very well educated, and the main thrust of his apologetics is to compare Scientology to other mainstream religions in terms of beliefs and practices, demonstrating that he fell 100% into the exact trap that Scientology specifically lays for such academics. Let's take a look at how he went about doing this. His essay begins. In several ways, Scientology is the most interesting of the new religious movements. It describes itself as an applied religious philosophy, but it does not fall easily under any exclusive label such as religion, science, philosophy, or technique. In a situation like this, the chances are many for misclassification and misrepresentation. For the time being, some designation like new religious movement or alternative religious movement seems the most appropriate for describing these recently recognized religious phenomena. You notice that he's setting up his apologetics argument right out of the gate. He says that Scientology is difficult to classify, but we'll just go ahead and call it a new religious movement because why not? The next pillar in his apologetics argument is to attack the very definitions of classification for religious groups. You have to pay close attention to Flynn because he's extremely crafty and well-versed in the materials he himself takes apart to make his arguments. If you don't watch closely, you won't notice the misdirection he uses as cleverly as an illusionist to fool you. The sociological classifications of different religious groups has been a hotly contested and debated topic for a number of years. We use words like church, sect, and cult, but because language is fluid and can often act like a living thing all on its own, the meanings of these terms and their connotations can change drastically. I use the term destructive cult because it's something I learned about after coming out of Scientology when I read the works of Janja Lalich and Michael Langone. I could just as easily call a group with such characteristics a yellow duck. It would still be the same thing. But when you get into broader classifications of legitimate mainstream and not so mainstream religious groups, you enter a very nebulous zone because of the wide spectrum of beliefs and organizations that are formed around those beliefs. Buddhism and Taoism are just as much religions as Christianity or Islam. Yet in trying to find common ground to define them that way, you're wading into a bit of a shark tank. Taking into account the thousands of different religious groups on Earth, your head can get pretty spinny pretty fast trying to figure it all out. Believe me, I've tried, and it really does take serious academic study to sort it all out. People like Flynn use that confusion to their advantage, to further their own agenda of trying to justify the existence of destructive cults, which can use religious cloaking to hide their true purposes. Whether Flynn is doing that maliciously or not is not my point, because I doubt that is the case. But here is what he says. The traditional sociological classification derived from Ernst Trollich's The Social Teaching of the Christian Churches, church, denomination, sect, and cult, has encountered difficulties. This is particularly true for the terms sect and cult, which have been most often applied to the newer religious groups. It is important to note that these are relational terms. Thus, the concept of sect takes on sharper definitional focus when related to organized churches that have become diffuse in doctrine and practice. Rodney Stark has captured this relational aspect well when he wrote that sects reflect the efforts of the churched to remain churched. The condition then for sect formation seems to be the presence of strongly organized churches. Conversely, the concept of cult takes on sharper definitional focus when related not to church, denomination, or sect, but to a prior condition of secularity. In Stark's words, the cult represents efforts by the unchurched to become churched. So now, a cult is defined as a group of people who were not part of an organized religion before, but now are. That's a new one. Have you ever heard of a cult described that way? Because I haven't. And what's more, it oversimplifies the term cult to describe it this way. My point isn't really whether Flynn is getting it right or not, though. It's that he is crafty about introducing doubt and ambiguity into the use of these terms at all. It's a logical fallacy of ambiguity, which is more understandable if I say that Flynn is muddying the waters. Now that he has introduced confusion into these terms, he doubles down on why you can't use the term sect or cult with Scientology. This definitional clarification, however, does not allow an unambiguous application of either cult or sect to Scientology. Sectarian movements are characterized by their over-againstness to organized religion. That is, they're separated from and contrasted to other religions. Yet, one characteristic peculiar to many of the new religions, including Scientology, Unificationists, and Charismatics, is the fact that they are pluri-denominational or trans-denominational in the religious affiliation of their adherents. Scientologists can remain in good standing as Scientologists even if they continue to participate in their natal or previously acquired religion. This is a widespread phenomenon among many new religions and even among some traditional ones. It is only superficially true that Scientologists are allowed to carry on with religious practices of a different faith. Believe me, if you want to go all the way to the top in Scientology, you are only going to make it by shedding any other religious belief system. This is especially true of the confidential upper OT levels of Scientology. Hubbard badmouths Christianity in plenty of places throughout Scientology lectures, but he makes no effort to conceal his utter disdain of any belief in Christ in the OT materials, and he expects the same of his followers. Flynn then goes on to talk about a Pentecostal meeting he went to where there were people of other faiths in attendance, so therefore Scientology is just like charismatic Catholics because they do the same thing too. I mean, Flynn is kind of all over the place on this point, but then concludes the thought by saying, truthfully, over time, the expectation is that Scientologists will center more and more on their own religious practices. And this seems, indeed, to be taking place. Well, if that's the case, then why go around the woods and over the bend to show that Scientology is not a cult because it accepts people of other denominations? I thought Flynn was engaging in a lot of ambiguity here. But then he stops muddling around and gets to a point. Sort of. Much of this depends upon where we are going to slice the pie. Although I do not want to say that the pie cannot or ought not to be sliced, the arbitrariness of the initial cut leaves me uneasy. I am uneasy, too, about what has happened to the word cult in the popular media. The popular image of a cult, a deranged tyrannical leader, brainwashing, and bizarre beliefs and practices, may have rendered the word permanently damaged for analytic purposes. No, those are all real things that actual groups do on a daily basis. What Flynn finds so unpalatable for some reason is that the word cult is used to describe these groups. For some twisted reasons, he thinks it's academically unacceptable to acknowledge that deranged people do deranged things to other people in the name of religious belief. Flynn would rather close his eyes to this reality, and not only that, but actually go so far as to justify their deranged behavior by calling it another form of religious expression. I think this poisons the well for real religions, and I think it's outrageous. Flynn then exposes a very gaping wound in our current constitutional law that allows this sort of thing to go on. Yet because he's an apologist, he uses this gaping wound to justify why he backs up these destructive cults instead of calling them out for what they are. Check this out. Furthermore, the word cult now impinges upon the legal interpretation and definition of what constitutes a religion. The U.S. Constitution uses only one word, religion, to designate the phenomenon we are talking about. Many anti-cultists believe that they have ipso facto established a religious group as a pseudo-religion if they have managed to get the group labeled as a cult in court proceedings. Elsewhere, I have argued that, from a constitutional viewpoint, judiciary can determine only that a group is or is not a religion. It cannot describe how a group is a religion. In other words, whether a group is a church, denomination, sect, or cult is constitutionally irrelevant. To make distinctions like these in court proceedings would be to establish certain religions, the traditional ones, over others, the innovative ones. If making such distinctions is not an actual establishment, it certainly is respecting an establishment. Now, here's the thing. Flynn is absolutely right that constitutionally there is only the one word, religion, to describe these groups, and that is how they get away with claiming First Amendment protections and escape the judgment of law against their abuses and all the rest. People have asked me many times how Scientology gets away with what they do and why the law doesn't seem to apply to them. Well, Flynn has just answered your question and told you the reasoning behind it. Yet because of this black and white thinking, destructive cults who hide behind religious cloaking escape any form of justice and can proudly walk around in courtrooms proclaiming their First Amendment protections. In the days when our founding fathers wrote our Constitution, they wanted to guarantee freedom of religion and ensure that the government would not allow a state-run religion to trample the rights of its citizens. This was smart thinking on their part. They could not predict how these freedoms would be twisted and corrupted by deranged, sick individuals for their personal and financial gain. It would have taken a super genius to predict the likes of L. Ron Hubbard back in 1776. So we're stuck with this one term, religion, to describe all of these groups, and we get the likes of Frank Flynn to support destructive cults because he thinks it's better to have that than to have religious tyranny. Well, how about an alternative solution? How about we actually take a modern look at this constitutional law and more clearly define what is a religious activity? Not to discourage real belief or sincere efforts at faith, but to stop these charlatans, quacks, and fanatics who laugh at the Constitution all the way to the bank. Or do we choose to take the bad with the good and put up with the televangelists who blatantly rip off the retirement savings of our senior citizens so they can buy 1 or 2 G6s? I mean, are we ever going to draw the line on this? Until we do, we can expect more and more of these religious con men, and there are enough ignorant and trusting people out there who will fall under their spell. It's in our nature to do so.